Hello and welcome back to Solomon's Cave. In the previous video of this series, I talked about what an argument was. Here I plan to give you extra tools with regard to logic that will help you for the rest of the series. First, I will help you recognize arguments in everyday speech. Most people, not even in formal debates, don't go about saying things like, "My first premise is this and my second premise is this, therefore I have conclusion so and so." Therefore it is important to look at everyday language and try to recognize the argument. Secondly, I will talk a little bit about reducing an argument down to its most basic components and to represent those in a symbolic form. This will look a little bit like algebra, but I will be sure to go slow enough so you won't get lost. Alright, so let's start with one of the simplest forms of an argument, and that is a syllogism. A basic syllogism has two premises and one conclusion. And the first premise is called the major premise. A major premise tells us something about the relationship between two things. For example, all men are mortal, or all blue things are made of cheese, or if it rains, the ground gets wet. In its simplest form, they can all be broken down to a simple if-then relationship. If the first thing is true, in these examples, there is a man, there is something blue, or it rains, then the second thing is also true. In these examples, he is mortal, it is made of cheese, or the ground is wet. And if you put it even simpler, you could say if A, then B, or A arrow B. And once you've managed to find the major premise in your argument, then the next challenge is to figure out which part of the major premise is A and which part is B. And then you call A the antecedent and B the consequent. By the way, I'm giving you a lot of new words to digest. Major premise, syllogism, antecedent, consequent, and there will be even more. But more important than remembering exactly which part of an argument is called what in English or in Latin is to understand what is going on. Because names and words and definitions, they can all change. But the underlying principle remains the same. So let's look at some examples of major premises and what they look like. Example 1. Doctor, my hand hurts every time I punch the wall. And just before I came in, I punched the wall. 2. All burgers are unhealthy. But this is a burrito, so it is perfectly healthy. 3. It must be raining because the streets are wet. 4. Vote for me and I will end the corruption. But now, 2 years later, the corruption still hasn't ended. So obviously you didn't vote for me. So going back to the first example, if A, then B. The A is, if I punch the wall. And the B is, then my hand hurts. In the second example, A, if there is a burger, or alternatively, if something is a burger, then B, then it isn't healthy. Third example, well, this one is a little tricky, because the major premise is not stated explicitly. But if we think about it a little, we will see it must be something like, if it rains, the streets are wet. Or in logical terms, A, if it rains, B, then the streets are wet. And then the fourth example, A, if you vote for me, B, then I will end the corruption. Now there are a few things to keep in mind here, when you look for a major premise in a text. First of all, English allows for A and B to switch places, like in example 1. 2. Key words like every time, example 1, or all, example 2, are helpful, but they are not necessarily always there. 3. When writing out your premise, you sometimes have to supply if there is, or if something is. See example 2. In everyday speech, you don't always have to state both premises explicitly. For example, example 3. So that was the major premise. Is there also a minor premise? Well, yes, there is. And the minor premise, in its basic form, says something about either A or B. Either something about the antecedent or the consequent. and it can say that A or B is the case or not. That is, it will either affirm or deny the antecedent or the consequent. So here are 4 of the simplest examples of minor premises. 1. There is A, or alternatively, something is A is the case, A is true, or in its simplest form, A. This affirms the antecedent. Alternatively, you could say, there is no A, or something is not A is not the case, A is not true, or in its most simple form, not A, or wavy line A. The wavy line is the most simple way of saying not. This denies the antecedent. Then option 3 is, there is B, in its most simplest form it's just B. This affirms the consequent. And then the 4th option is, there is no B, or in its simplest form again, wavy line B, and this denies the consequent. If your minor premise does not mention the antecedent or the consequent, then you can already dismiss the argument, because then the major and the minor premises together cannot form a proper argument. So let's get back to the previous examples and add a minor premise. Example 1. Here the minor premise is, I punched the wall. That is affirming the antecedent. Then the second example. If you want to say, but this is a burrito, you're basically saying, this is not a burger. So you deny the antecedent. Not A. Then the third example. The minor premise is, the streets are wet, which affirms the consequent. And then the final example. Here the minor premise is, the corruption did not end. This denies the consequent, or not B. So let's write all 4 of these symbolic ways to make an argument in a schedule. In the top line you have the major premises. All of them are A, arrow B, so A therefore B. And then example 1 we have A, example 2 we have not A, example 3 we have B, and example 4 we have not B. So after the major and minor premises, all that is left is the conclusion. Conclusions are what follows from the major and the minor premises. And in the most simple syllogisms, they say something about the other parts of the major premise. That is the part the minor premise does not mention. So if the minor premise talks about the antecedent, the conclusion talks about the consequent. If the minor premise talks about the consequent, the conclusion talks about the antecedent. And though you could theoretically construct a syllogism by flipping the affirmation or the denial and vice versa, the most common examples have it such that if the minor premise affirms something, the conclusion affirms something, and if the minor premise denies something, the conclusion denies something. So let's apply this to the examples that we've seen. In the first example, the conclusion is, therefore, B, my hand hurts. Although in this case, the conclusion is not stated explicitly, so we have to supply it. In the second example, the conclusion is, therefore, not B, this is not unhealthy. Then the third example, A, therefore it must be raining. And then in the final example, therefore, the politician lied. No, okay, I'm just kidding. Well, not really, but logically speaking, a conclusion would be, therefore, not A, you did not vote for me. And the symbolical representation of therefore is 3 dots that form a pyramid, which leads to the previous examples looking like this. Example 1, A therefore B, A therefore B. Example 2, A therefore B, not A, therefore not B. Example 3, A therefore B, B therefore A. Example 4, A therefore B, not B, therefore not A. Now the validity and invalidity of these arguments will be something for the next video, but I want to end with a few more points about language that should be kept in mind. First of all, conclusions can just as easily be put at the beginning or the end of an argument. If they are at the beginning, they are usually followed by because. See example 3. Now that we have the basics covered, we are ready to have a look at which of these arguments are valid and which are invalid. And then we can also look at other types of syllogisms and arguments. If you want to stay up to date with news and announcements, follow me on social media, and don't forget to like, share and subscribe.